Hello and welcome to Mindful Biology. This is the fourth of 5 sessions about sensitivity. As biological organisms, our bodies are sensitive. They respond to external cues, letting us know about opportunities and dangers, and they respond to internal sensations that provide valuable information. In this series, we are talking about the skin predominantly, but the topic of sensitivity is a very broad and applicable one across many aspects of biology. So we're exploring sensitivity by looking at the 4 so-called channels of bodily experience that were outlined in earlier sessions. As a brief review, we spoke about the body as an object. So this is when our language capacities and analytical abilities look at the body and see it as something separate, something that can be categorized, compared, managed, and so on. This is the body actually of biology, of science. The body is looked at as something separate from the mind. It's also the body that we criticize or worry about, as well as the body that we try to optimize in terms of its health and appearance, etc. The mammal body is a body of direct sensory and internal experience. So this is the body that feels hunger and pain, that responds to cues that suggest that various appetites can be satisfied, that feels fear and sadness and anger, and also happiness and passion, and so on. So the mammal body is a very rich and direct experience. The suffering that we contend with in life arises mainly from interactions between the object and mammal body experiences. So the mammal body, of course, feels pain and discomfort. But then the mind, the thinking and analyzing capacity, looks at that bodily sensation, that pain or that difficult circumstance or whatever it is, and feels that it shouldn't be there and develops a sense of basic wrongness, of unhappiness. And then that unhappiness translates into more bodily distress, which leads to another cycle of analysis and comparison, and so on. I'm sure you have many examples from your own experience that fit that model more or less. Now, when we get over to the cell and universe bodies, we are in the realm that supports equanimity. We'll be talking about the cell body predominantly today, so I won't mention too much about it now. Next time we'll be talking about the universe body, which will bring everything together and lead us toward greater capacity to experience our bodies as seamlessly and indivisibly connected with the cosmos at large, with everyone and everything around us. Now, the cell and universe bodies are ongoing experiences. We have them in the field of awareness, but they tend to be very subtle and barely noticed. The practice then is one of learning to tune in to these channels that we tend to neglect. And we'll begin today by tuning in to the channel of the cell-body experience. This is the diffuse feeling of aliveness in the body. So every part of our body feels alive when we turn our attention toward it. So if I suggest that you direct your attention toward your left foot or your right hand, you can tune into them quite easily. And whatever you might feel there, whether there's a feeling of pleasure or discomfort or warmth or coolness, whatever you feel is superimposed on a baseline sense that the body part is there and that it is part of you and that it is alive, that it has sensation. So it's that background and very diffuse quality of aliveness that I'm referring to as the cell body. It can have a tingling or vibrating aspect to it. It often feels like it flows a little bit. And I tend to think of it as roughly identical to what is referred to as qi in Chinese medicine, or as prana, or life energy, or subtle energy in other traditions. So this is a diffuse but very palpable sensation of life in the body. Because we're not often trained or encouraged to tune into it, we may not pay much attention to it, but this is something that can change. We can cultivate our capacity to feel the diffuse aliveness in the body. Now, I refer to it as the cell body because I believe there is a connection between this sensation and the cellularity that makes up a biological organism, but the word is pretty unimportant. What matters most is the ability to feel this steady, relatively unchanging experience of pure and diffuse aliveness. So the energetic quality, the alive quality may flow and vibrate a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty steady and largely unaffected by our day-to-day experience. And this is why it's so healthful to learn to tune into it. It can be met in any aspect of bodily experience, but in this class, we are focusing on the skin, and so we will continue that theme. So here's the skin. We're very familiar with it. We understand, at least in principle, that it covers a lot of biology, muscle, bone, vital organs, and so on. And all of those living processes require a fairly constant internal environment to function properly, and the skin helps ensure that by sealing and protecting the body. When we zoom in, we see the characteristic appearance. So the skin has a little bit of the quality of leather. It's tough, it's water repellent, and it gets those qualities from a layer of dry skin cells very tightly stuck to one another that forms the surface layer. Those dry skin cells come from a deeper layer that we refer to as the epidermis. When we zoom in on the epidermis, we can see, I'm highlighting it here for effect, but we could see, looking closely, some flattened cells that are on their way toward becoming part of that dried and hardened exterior. Now, because there is constant friction against the body, these cells, after they harden and form part of the outer layer, they don't last very long. They get rubbed off pretty quickly, generally in a matter of weeks. So there needs to be a constant replenishment. So down in the base of the epidermis, there is ongoing cell division that replaces the overlying layers. The cells, after they are born, so to speak, after cell division, gradually move toward the surface of the epidermis, flattening as they go, and eventually drying out, becoming non-viable, and forming part of that tough outer covering. So the cells down in the base of the epidermis are reproducing themselves quite frequently, and they do so by cell division. Now, all biological cells come into being through a process of cell division. So here's a yeast cell, just to give us a picture, a living picture of what cell division does. So the yeast cell can divide, and it does so. And so it puts off a little bud, and another little bud, and then those buds continue to divide also, and gradually, in fact fairly quickly, the numbers build up, and through this exuberant process of cell division, we get ever-increasing population of yeast cells. And something similar, though much more controlled, is going on in our skin. In fact, of course, it's going on in many parts of the body. And this is the exuberance of life. And I think it's this exuberance that is part of what we feel when we feel that diffuse aliveness. The cells have this vibrancy, this impetus to grow and to maintain themselves and to live. It's my suspicion, which I can't prove, but I find it useful to hang on to it as a point of belief, at least provisional, that we can feel this cellular exuberance in our skin and elsewhere. So a nice meditation can be to simply feel the raw, alive sensation across the entirety of the skin surface. Just notice that no matter where you direct your attention, you will feel the skin as an alive presence in your awareness. Of course, the skin cells are complex biological entities in their own right. This cell was stained in order to highlight the interior architecture that's present in all cells, but is especially prominent in these epidermal cells because they are serving to form a tough protective layer, and so they have some excess fibers in them in order to make them tough. There's a lot more going on inside a cell. Here's a paramecium, a familiar one-celled organism, and as we quickly scan it, you can see it's got a lot going on in there. There's stuff streaming and moving and a lot of granularity, and those granules are each highly structured biological elements. So that when we watch a paramecium in action, this one is feeding itself, we can appreciate that it's a complex biological organism and that it's doing all the important things that organisms do. It feeds, it excretes waste, it reproduces, it responds to stimuli, it escapes threat, etc. To me, this looks for all the world like a little chicken might look in a barnyard, moving around, pecking at little bits of seed and insects and so on in the soil. It doesn't seem impossible to me that this little critter might feel a little bit of hunger when it hasn't had food for a while and a little bit of satisfaction when it's able to graze and feed. Hard to prove that, but I don't see why we should exclude the very possibility. Or when we look at two paramecia together, there's a sense in which they seem at least somewhat aware of each other. You can see them kind of contacting and maybe even investigating one another a little bit. It's probably a bit of a stretch, but I can look at these and liken them a little bit to two dogs, interacting with each other a little bit casually, sniffing one another, moving past one another, etc. Obviously, the paramecium can't have a complexity of awareness anywhere near that of a dog because it's just one cell after all. But I think it's at least worth considering the possibility that they might have a tiny bit of rudimentary sentience. The paramecium may even do things that we can recognize as sort of misguided. So this one is trying to eat this single-celled photosynthetic organism, and it has to decide after a period of time that it's just not possible, that it's bitten off more than it can chew, so to speak. And so you watch this little organism attempt to do something and then reach a decision that it can't succeed after all, and then move away. Again, at least consistent with the idea that there is some sort of motivation in here, some ability to assess a circumstance and to back away from it. Suggestive, I believe, of a little bit of awareness. So when we look at a cell like this and we wonder where the feeling of aliveness comes diffusely in our body, we can at least suspect that it might have something to do with the cells themselves. Well, when we look even deeper into the cell, we see even more reason to be impressed, because those fibers I mentioned earlier are quite complex and perform a number of important functions, some of them acting a little bit like muscle fibers, some of them being more like bones that provide structure, and some of them even serving as transport lines. So to emphasize that transport function, we can look at this fiber here that we're highlighting. You'll see that it has, sort of walking along it, this protein complex shown by the arrow. When we animate it again in a moment, you'll see that this thing takes steps, walks one foot after the other, so to speak. You can also see that it's connected to a kind of package, a round vesicle, above by a tether, shown in the rectangle. And now, as we animate, we can see that the little walker carries that package along the fiber. Here we're seeing another one coming in from the right, another little walking protein. And it's going to move in and secure a package for delivery. So here comes the vesicle, the package, and then it's going to be captured by the upper end of the walking protein, and it's secured there and carried on its way. And we can look at this whole process again, this time without the highlighting. Here comes the walking protein with its little feet moving along the cable, holding the vesicle by the tether. And here comes the walker that's going to pick up its vesicle, which it does right there, and carries it forward. To my eye, the interior of this cell looks a little bit aquatic, a bit like a coral reef, emphasizing how the interior of the cell has its own living environment, in a sense, its own ecology. And so a lot of what I'm hoping to convey in these classes is the organic, natural aspect of the body, how our bodies are parts of nature and have natural processes operating within them and often look a lot like natural landscapes. So we can appreciate when we watch a paramecium or any organism, any single-celled animal, doing this kind of tumbling or acrobatic movement, that a lot is happening in there, that this is clearly responding to some inward motivation that says it wants to make that kind of U-turn and flip itself around. It has its interior structures with all the fibers and the walking proteins and a whole lot more that gives it this quality of being alive and motile. It's a very small but very complete example of the power of life. And it's this power of life that we have in every one of the trillions of cells in our bodies, including every skin cell. So we can remember that the skin is alive in this very real and very palpable, I would say, fashion. That it does indeed, as I've said in prior episodes, form a living fabric, a garment of life around the body, and that we are in effect held within its embrace. And so a very nice meditation can be feeling the wrapping of the skin around the body as a warm blanket or even a warm embrace. So we have seen how the skin covers the biology inside the body, that it seals and protects. Of course, the skin also senses the environment. It also absorbs heat when we're warming ourselves in the sun, or it radiates heat when we perspire. In other words, the skin is mediating a lot of our contact with the outside world. Now, single-celled organisms, or any cell, also has a kind of covering or skin. We call that the cell membrane, shown in a very simple fashion here. And we can open this membrane up and look into the interior of the cell. So the membrane now is the yellow squiggly ring around everything else. And we see that within the cell there's a lot of biology. And in fact, this is such a simple diagram that it probably only represents maybe 1,000th of the amount of structure that actually would be in this cell at this scale, and maybe even less than that. But it gives the idea that there's important stuff inside the cell. So one purpose of that cell membrane, in essence the cell's skin, is to keep all that valuable stuff inside and also to prevent harmful stuff from entering from the outside. So we could say that one purpose of skin, whether of a body or of a cell, is containment. To contain a healthy interior environment and to protect it from contamination. But there's another aspect to the skin of the body and also the skin of the cell. I already mentioned how the body exchanges heat with the environment. In the case of the living cell, it needs to get foodstuffs or nutrients from the outside, as well as water and various hormonal signals if it's part of a body. Sometimes have to be internalized, or at least the signal has to be brought in. And at the same time, stuff has to be sent out, particularly waste products, but also, if for instance this is a cell in a gland, some kind of glandular product has to be expelled also. And the cell membrane has to allow for all of that to occur one way or another. We could call that aspect of membrane function, openness. So there's a dynamism between containment and openness that is central in many ways to all life. And this was a point that was made in the first video of the Vitality series. If you want to scroll down on the website and view it, it also connects containment and openness with the idea of chi and body energy. The surfaces of living organisms are dynamic not only on a moment-by-moment basis, but also through time. So the cell membrane evolved over time, and our skin has evolved over time. I believe we are all aware that humans are believed, on the basis of a lot of evidence, to have evolved from an ancestor that looked a lot more like an ape than a present-day human. And there were a lot of changes that occurred over time as the human species came into being, including a more upright posture and, in particular, for our purposes, a loss of body hair. The reason for the change in body covering, as well as many of the other evolutionary adaptations, is believed by the people who study these issues to relate to a change in climate that occurred in the area of Africa where our early ancestors were evolving. No doubt many were not able to adapt to the change as the terrain gave way from forests to open grasslands or savanna. But the ones that did manage to survive adapted a new lifestyle. One hypothesis is that they were successful because they learned to chase game, to run them down over long periods, possibly by working in teams until the animals collapsed from the heat. Because after all, this was a very hot, exposed environment. By losing body hair, the pre-humans were able to run in this hot, exposed environment for longer periods than the prey. And this opened for them a high protein, high energy food supply that really aided their survival. So there was a huge evolutionary advantage to losing the body hair. And of course, that means that the skin changed quite a bit, because the skin is the producer of hair. The skin also became vulnerable in a way that it had not been before, because ultraviolet rays from the sun could now reach the skin, and if they weren't deflected, they could penetrate and cause changes in the cells, mutations that would lead to skin cancers. As long as there was hair covering the skin, this wasn't such an issue, but without the hair, it was a serious problem. The solution that biology came up with over evolutionary time was to deposit a lot of pigment granules in the skin, which would deflect the solar radiation and protect from malignant degeneration. Much more recently, bands of humans migrated north to cooler and less sunny climates. This was on the order of tens of thousands of years ago. In those regions, the issue wasn't excess solar radiation and ultraviolet exposure. The threat they faced was inadequate vitamin D synthesis, because our bodies produce vitamin D only under the influence of sunlight striking the skin. And if insufficient sun impinges on the skin, then we are not going to have enough vitamin D. So the pigment that was so vital in hot, sunny climates is something of a liability in cooler, less sunny ones. In addition, there's no longer the pressure to maintain the pigment because there isn't so much ultraviolet exposure. And so over the generations, the skin of these northern bands adapted to allow more sun penetration, less pigmentation was deposited in the skin, and the appearance became more pale, as we know. So these pigmentary changes related to sun exposure as described led over many generations to the variations in skin tone that we're so familiar with today. It seems rather tragic that something that has such a straightforward biological explanation would be used to create such division and to cause such misery and oppression, because it's a simple biological adaptation to different circumstances in different regions. Well, the changes in skin pigmentation can occur on much shorter timescales, of course, because we can develop suntan. So any human skin exposed to the sun will tend to darken, and areas that are protected will tend to remain less dark. And this is true of pale skin, as is common for people who descended from Northern Europeans, and it's also true for darker skin, characteristic of people that came, for instance, from Africa in their ancestry. So we have regions of darkness and regions of lightness in these feet, presumably because of some sort of footwear that shielded part of the foot from the sun. Well, whenever the skin changes color, whether over evolutionary time or under the influence of a suntan, what's going on is that the cells of the skin are acquiring pigment granules from specialized cells that are much less numerous, that are called melanocytes, or we could just call them melanin cells. So these scattered melanin cells at the base of the epidermis produce pigment or melanin granules that they then transfer to the skin cells that are migrating through the epidermis to become that tough outer layer. If a lot of pigment is deposited, then the ultraviolet is deflected, and if not, it penetrates. And here we can see this in action. So the skin cell is to the left and the melanin cell to the right. And the melanin cell has sent out these little extensors that reach the skin cell, hold on to it, and transfer granules to it, effectively making it a little bit more pigmented, a little darker. So this is another aspect of bodily life. These cells in the skin are altering their behavior according to local conditions, to how much sun is received locally in the skin. That was the point of the suntan lines. And so there's a kind of responsiveness that we might even call intelligence in the skin, that it acts in response to circumstance. In this case, the local circumstance of being exposed to sun, but there are a lot of other influences, including genetic and hormonal and so on. But the entire system has a clear responsiveness, a clear adaptiveness that we could perhaps call intelligence, continuing the theme of imagining that our cells have not only a life force, not only perhaps a little bit of sentience, but also demonstrably a capacity to respond intelligently to circumstance. A meditation that can highlight this quality of containment is to really sit in the presence of the skin and wear it as a garment that is holding or hugging the body and feel enclosed and protected and contained by it. And I'll suggest that meditation as a final one today to emphasize the fact that boundaries are important to living organisms, and our skin is providing some aspect of this sense that we have autonomy, that there is an edge that we and the body rightfully protect. So there's a containment and a safety aspect to this skin that surrounds us, and we can feel protected and enwrapped and embraced. And so I'll suggest that as a final meditation for this session. In the next episode, we will look at that so-called universe body, and we will explore not so much the containment, but the openness, remembering that containment and openness are in dynamic interplay, and that this underpins the energy of life. So this concludes this episode of Mindful Biology. As mentioned, we will talk about the universe body in the next episode. Thank you for your interest.